The 1980s sold itself as neon excess and pop fantasy, but behind the box office smiles a darker war was being fought in editing rooms and censorship offices. These movies were not just entertainment. They were declared dangerous, corrupting, and unwatchable. Tonight we restore the blood, the rage, and the truth. Number 13. A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984. When A Nightmare on Elm Street first hit cinemas, audiences believed they were seeing a mainstream studio horror film. What they did not know was how much violence had already been carved away before release. Wes Craven originally conceived the film as far darker, with longer death scenes, more lingering suffering, and harsher implications of Freddy Krueger's crimes. Studio fears over rating backlash forced multiple trims, especially to Tina's bedroom murder, which was shortened to avoid prolonged visible torment. The uncut and restored versions reveal a very different tone. Tina's death lasts longer and feels more brutal, with additional shots emphasizing helplessness and panic rather than quick shock. Glenn's infamous bed geyser of blood was also shortened in early releases. The uncut footage lingers longer, making the moment feel less surreal comedy and more nightmarish violation. These changes deepen Freddy's role not as a quip-driven villain, but as an unstoppable predator who kills slowly and deliberately. International versions faced even harsher cuts, especially in the United Kingdom, where dream violence was considered especially disturbing for young viewers. Restored editions finally show how Elm Street was originally meant to feel like a waking nightmare rather than a popcorn slasher. The uncut film explains why Freddy terrified a generation. He was not funny yet. He was cruel, personal, and inescapable. Number 12. Zombie Flesheaters, 1979 released 80. Lucio Fulci's Zombie Flesheaters entered the 80s already condemned. While produced in the late 70s, it became a censorship nightmare throughout the next decade. Many countries released butchered versions, missing minutes of violence, including the infamous eye splinter scene and extended gut-eating sequences. In some territories, entire reels were removed, leaving incoherent narratives stitched together by fear. The uncut version is a relentless assault. Fulci refuses quick cuts. He lets the camera watch as flesh is torn slowly and methodically. The eye splinter scene is longer and far more agonizing than most viewers ever saw during the 80s. The shark versus zombie fight, which was removed entirely in some releases, remains intact, showcasing Fulci's obsession with surreal brutality rather than realism. Censors claim the film glorified violence. In reality, the uncut version reveals something colder. Humanity is already dead. The violence is not exciting. It is inevitable. The restored cut transforms Zombie Flesheaters from a messy gore film into a nihilistic horror poem about decay. This is the version Fulci intended and the one the 80s were not prepared to face. Number 11. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978 banned through 80s. No film on this list was more aggressively targeted than I Spit on Your Grave. Though made in the late 70s, it became a censorship obsession throughout the 80s. Theatrical versions were cut heavily or banned outright, with violence removed from both the assault and revenge sections. What remained was often confusing, morally unbalanced, and emotionally hollow. The uncut version is deeply uncomfortable by design. The assault sequences are longer, more explicit, and harder to watch. This was not exploitation accident. Director Mir Zarchi intended the brutality to be confrontational, forcing viewers to experience the horror rather than consume it casually. When the revenge arrives, it too is more extended and more graphic, restoring a sense of emotional symmetry that censored versions destroyed. Censors claimed the film was sadistic. The uncut version reveals something more disturbing. It is accusatory. It asks why audiences tolerate violence only when it is edited into comfort. Restored editions do not make the film easier to watch. They make it honest. This honesty is exactly why the 80s tried to erase it. Number 10. Scanners, 1981. Scanners became infamous for a single moment that defined 80s shock cinema. The exploding head scene was so sudden and graphic that it triggered immediate censorship panic. Many theatrical prints were trimmed to soften the impact, removing frames, reducing blood spray, and shortening the aftermath. Some television versions eliminated the scene entirely, turning a landmark moment into a confusing cutaway. The uncut version restores the full sequence in brutal clarity. The head does not simply explode, it ruptures slowly in stages, with skin-tearing pressure building and blood mist filling the air. The scene lingers long enough for the audience to process what they are seeing rather than recoil and forget. This timing is everything. David Cronenberg wanted viewers to understand that psychic power in this world is not magical. It is violent, invasive, and fatal. Beyond the famous explosion, other moments were trimmed in the 80s, including extended convulsions and body damage during scanner duels. Restored cuts show how much physical suffering accompanies mental warfare. Veins bulge, eyes bleed, and bodies collapse under internal pressure. This is not clean science fiction. It is body horror at its most clinical. The uncut scanners reframes the film as a warning about unchecked experimentation and corporate weaponization. Violence is not spectacle here, it is consequence. The 80s tried to mute that message by trimming the gore. Restoration puts the fear back where Cronenberg intended, inside the body where control is an illusion. Number 9. Hellraiser, 1987. Hellraiser arrived late in the decade and still managed to terrify censors. Clive Barker's vision of pain, pleasure, and transformation was unlike anything mainstream horror had embraced. Early releases were trimmed to avoid excessive flesh-tearing, prolonged suffering, and explicit body reconstruction. What audiences saw was shocking. What was removed was far worse. The uncut version restores extended gore during Frank's resurrection, showing muscle, sinew, and bone reforming piece by piece. These scenes were shortened in the 80s to avoid accusations of sadism. In their full form, they are slow, methodical, and ritualistic. Barker wanted rebirth to feel obscene rather than triumphant. The body does not return clean. It crawls back through agony. Other restored moments include longer Cenobite interactions and extended flaying imagery. These additions deepen the mythology. Pain is not random violence. It is law. The Cenobites are not killers. They are enforcers of a contract humanity does not understand until it is too late. Censors treated Hellraiser as splatter horror. The uncut version reveals it as dark fantasy philosophy. Flesh is currency, desire is trap, and violence is inevitable once the box is opened. The 80s could not accept a horror film that refused moral comfort. Restoration finally lets Hellraiser breathe and bleed as intended. Number 8. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, 1986. Tobe Hooper shocked audiences by turning his grim original into a grotesque carnival of excess. Yet even this exaggerated sequel faced heavy censorship. The 80s feared not just gore, but tone. The film was cut to reduce prolonged chainsaw attacks, sexualized violence, and scenes where horror crossed into absurdity. The uncut version restores extended killings and longer sequences of Leatherface at work. Victims suffer longer. The camera watches more closely. These moments were trimmed to prevent accusations of glorifying sadism. But Hooper's intent was satire. By exaggerating violence, he was holding a mirror to the slasher boom that misunderstood his original film. Restored footage also strengthens the film's sense of madness. The family is not just violent. They are theatrical. Their cruelty is performative and ridiculous. Cutting these scenes in the 80s flattened the film into standard horror, removing its commentary on media exploitation and desensitization. The uncut version reveals Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2 as a screaming parody of censorship culture itself. Violence is so over the top it becomes grotesque comedy. The 80s tried to tame it. Restoration lets it roar, laugh, and offend exactly as Hooper intended. Number 7. Dawn of the Dead, 1978, censored through 80s. Dawn of the Dead may have been released before the decade began, but the 80s became its true battleground. Censors across multiple countries treated the film as a public threat. Theatrical prints were cut, recut, and re-edited throughout the decade, removing gore, violence, and even entire subplots. What many audiences saw was a weakened shadow of George A. Romero's vision. The uncut version restores the full brutality of the shopping mall massacre. Zombies are not dispatched quickly. Heads explode, bodies are torn apart, and blood coats consumer paradise in thick red irony. Romero lingered on violence intentionally. He wanted the audience to feel complicit. Shopping continues while the world dies. Cutting the gore dulled that message and turned satire into simple spectacle. Restored footage also deepens the emotional toll on survivors. Violence is not just external. It erodes humanity. Extended scenes show characters becoming numb, reckless, and cruel. The mall becomes a tomb disguised as comfort. These moments were removed in censored versions to keep pacing tight and tone lighter. The uncut Dawn of the Dead is not a fun zombie romp. It is an accusation. It tells viewers that society will decorate its collapse and call it survival. The 80s tried to make it safer. Restoration makes it honest and far more disturbing. Number 6. The Burning, 1981. The Burning was one of the most aggressively cut slashers of the era. Its original theatrical version removed multiple kill shots, trimmed violence, and reduced the infamous Raft Massacre to fragments. Censors believed the film crossed a line by presenting prolonged suffering rather than quick thrills. The uncut version restores the raft scene in full, savage detail. Victims are stalked, burned, and hacked in extended shots that refuse to look away. The violence feels chaotic, desperate, and cruel. This was not accidental. Director Tony Maylam wanted the attack to feel like a nightmare with no escape. Other restored scenes include longer burns and close-up wounds that were removed to avoid an X rating. These additions transform the killer Cropsey from a generic slasher into a symbol of vengeance consumed by pain. The burns linger. The damage remains visible. Violence leaves marks that do not vanish between cuts. In its uncut form, The Burning is less entertaining and far more unsettling. It forces viewers to confront the cost of revenge rather than cheer it. The 80s cut it down to size. Restoration brings back its raw edge and explains why it frightened censors in the first place. Number 5. Friday the 13th Part 2, 1981. Friday the 13th, Part 2 suffered quietly under censorship scissors. Unlike flashier titles, its cuts were subtle but numerous. Kill scenes were shortened. Impacts were removed and reactions were trimmed to keep the violence quick and bloodless enough for mass release. The uncut version restores extended deaths that give weight to each kill. Machete strikes land harder. Victims struggle longer. The camera stays just long enough to register fear and pain. These moments were considered excessive at the time, yet they are essential to understanding Jason as a relentless presence rather than a punchline. Restored footage also reinforces the film's bleak atmosphere. This is not campfire fun. It is isolation, punishment, and inevitability. By trimming violence, the 80s transformed Jason into a mascot. The uncut version shows him as a force that grinds people down without mercy. Friday the 13th, Part 2, in its restored form, explains why the series became controversial before it became iconic. Violence here is not creative spectacle. It is blunt, repetitive, and exhausting. That exhaustion was what censors tried to remove. Restoration puts it back, and with it the true tone of early slasher horror. Number 4. Maniac, 1980. Maniac terrified censors because it did something few horror films dared attempt. It erased distance. The camera does not observe violence from safety, it inhabits it. Much of the film is shot from the killer's perspective, forcing the audience to see women not as characters, but as targets through Frank Zito's eyes. During the 80s, this alone was enough to trigger aggressive censorship. Extended stalking shots, first-person murders, and graphic scalp removals were cut to weaken the film's psychological impact. The uncut version restores this suffocating intimacy. Frank follows victims for long stretches of time. The camera lingers on breathing footsteps and hesitation before the attack. When violence erupts, it is slow, clumsy, and deeply uncomfortable. Victims struggle, scream, and attempt to escape rather than dying cleanly. These moments were removed because they refused to offer relief or fantasy. They trap the viewer inside the act. Restored footage also deepens Frank's unraveling mind. His apartment, filled with mannequins, becomes a shrine to control and failed intimacy. The violence escalates as his mental state collapses. Cutting these scenes reduced Maniac to exploitation. The uncut version reveals it as a grim character study about loneliness, untreated trauma, and urban decay. In full form, Maniac feels less like a slasher and more like a confession no one wants to hear. The 80s tried to silence it. Restoration forces audiences to confront the horror of identification itself. Number 3. The Driller Killer, 1979, released 80. The Driller Killer became infamous before most people ever saw it. Its title artwork and reputation alone were enough to trigger seizures of video copies across the 80s. Violence was trimmed, banned, and condemned, often without context. What censors feared was not just blood, but the film's raw, abrasive realism. The uncut version restores extended drilling scenes that are deliberately unpleasant rather than thrilling. Attacks are messy, frantic, and repetitive. Victims panic, scream, and collapse without cinematic flair. These sequences were shortened to reduce outrage, but their length is the point. Violence here is not cathartic, it is exhausting. Restored footage also emphasizes the city as a character. Noise, poverty, hunger, and creative failure crush the protagonist slowly. The drill is not a weapon of power, it is a release valve for mental collapse. The longer scenes show how violence erupts from pressure rather than desire. In uncut form, The Driller Killer becomes a portrait of urban alienation. It predicts the psychological toll of overcrowded cities and artistic desperation. The 80s saw only gore. Restoration reveals despair lurking beneath the noise. Number 2. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. Cannibal Holocaust was treated as radioactive throughout the 80s. Entire countries banned it outright. Scenes were removed, mutilated, or reordered. Animal deaths, village massacres, and prolonged suffering were stripped away, leaving incoherent fragments. Some versions removed so much footage that the film's message collapsed entirely. The uncut version restores the full found footage structure. Violence is abrupt, chaotic, and unglamorous. People die suddenly without music cues or heroic framing. Massacres unfold with clinical detachment. This was the real threat. The film presents violence as documentation rather than entertainment. Restored scenes clarify the moral mirror at the center of the film. The documentary crew commits atrocities first. Their later deaths are consequences, not punishment fantasies. Cutting these parallels turned the film into meaningless shock. The uncut version restores its accusation against media exploitation, sensationalism, and voyeurism. In full form, Cannibal Holocaust is not asking viewers to endure violence. It is asking why they watch it. The 80s could not tolerate a film that turned the lens back on the audience. Restoration makes that challenge unavoidable. Number 1. The Evil Dead, 1981. The Evil Dead did not frighten censors because of a single shocking moment. It frightened them because it refused to stop. From its opening minutes, the film attacks with relentless rhythm, never allowing the audience to rest or reset. Even in its earliest theatrical releases, much of this brutality had already been trimmed. Extended possessions, prolonged beatings, and additional dismemberment shots were removed to reduce intensity. What remained was still infamous, but it was not the full assault Sam Raimi intended. The uncut version restores the film's merciless pacing. Possession scenes last longer and feel more invasive. Bodies convulse, bend, and betray their owners without relief. Characters are dragged across floors, slammed into walls, and forced to watch their friends transform into enemies. These moments were shortened because they were exhausting. That exhaustion is the point. Raimi wanted horror to feel like survival, not spectacle. Restored footage also amplifies the film's cruelty toward its characters. There is no heroic framing. Violence arrives suddenly, and often without warning. Demonic forces mock, torment, and manipulate. The cabin becomes a trap where every object conspires against the living. Cutting violence softened this sense of inevitability. The uncut version restores the feeling that escape was never possible. In full form, The Evil Dead is not playful. It is feral, desperate, and punishing. It does not reward bravery or intelligence. It simply grinds its characters down. The 80s tried to tame it into a cult curiosity. Restoration reveals it as a horror endurance test that dares the audience to last as long as the characters do. The 80s wanted horror loud, but controlled shocking, but contained. These films refused those rules. They were cut, banned, and buried because they exposed violence as consequence rather than thrill. If you want more restored cinema forbidden cuts and the stories censors tried to erase, like and subscribe because the truth was never meant to stay hidden.